The soft glow of the laptop screen illuminated Sarah Harris's face as she sat hunched over her desk in the small living room of her Los Angeles apartment. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second a reminder of the looming deadline for her latest graphic design project. Her fingers danced across the keyboard. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she adjusted the color palette of a client's logo for what felt like the 100th time. Beside her, a half-finished cup of coffee sat cold, forgotten in the chaos of her work. The silence of the apartment was broken only by the occasional sound of puzzle pieces clicking together. Her 6-year-old son, Ethan, was sprawled on the carpet, deeply engrossed in assembling a dinosaur puzzle. His small fingers moved with precision, carefully matching each piece to form the head of a T-Rex. Sarah glanced over at him, her heart softening at the sight. The way Ethan's brown eyes lit up with every small victory was like looking into a mirror of herself. Focused, determined, but always a little lost in his own world. "Mom, look! I finished the T-Rex's head!" Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts, his tone brimming with pride. Sarah turned her gaze from the screen to her son's beaming face, forcing a smile despite the knot of stress in her chest. Those brown eyes, so much like her own, sparkled with accomplishment. "That's amazing, buddy," she said warmly, momentarily forgetting the tension of her work. "Just a bit more and it'll be complete." Ethan nodded enthusiastically before diving back into his puzzle, his small shoulders hunched in concentration. Just then, her smartphone buzzed on the desk, shattering the brief moment of peace. The screen lit up with the word "Mom," and Sarah's stomach tightened. She sighed, knowing exactly what was coming. Linda Harris had a knack for calling at the worst possible times, and tomorrow's family trip to Universal Studios was already a sore spot between them. Sarah hesitated for a moment before pressing the answer button, bracing herself for the inevitable lecture. "Hey, Mom," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Linda's voice came through the speaker, sharp and commanding, with that familiar bossy tone that always made Sarah feel like a teenager again. "Make sure you pack sunscreen for Ethan. If he gets burned like last time, we'll have to drag him to the dermatologist again, and I don't have time for that nonsense." Sarah closed her eyes, pinching the bridge of her nose. The memory of their last family outing flashed through her mind. A blistering day at the beach where Ethan had ended up with a mild sunburn. Linda had spent the entire drive home lecturing her on proper parenting, as if Sarah hadn't felt guilty enough already. "Of course I'm ready," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with a slight edge as she glanced at the half-packed duffel bag on the couch. "I've got almost everything sorted." She didn't mention the fact that she'd barely slept the past 2 nights, juggling client revisions and preparing for the trip. Nor did she mention the conference call scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, an urgent meeting with a big client that she couldn't reschedule, even if it meant working in the middle of a theme park. "Have you talked to Jessica yet?" Linda pressed on, oblivious to Sarah's mounting stress. "She's got matching t-shirts for Mia and Noah. They'll look adorable in the photos." Sarah's jaw tightened. Jessica Brooks, her older sister, had a way of turning every family event into a photo op for her Instagram perfect life. Her 2 kids, Mia and Noah, were always dressed to the nines, their smiles plastered across Jessica's social media with captions about mom goals and family adventures. Meanwhile, Sarah was just trying to keep her head above water as a single mom. "Not yet," Sarah said, her tone clipped. "I'll call her tonight." She didn't bother mentioning that she hadn't had a spare second to think about matching t-shirts or Instagram posts. Ethan was more interested in his puzzles and anime characters than posing for pictures, and Sarah was fine with that. But to Linda, it was a cardinal sin. "Those kids need to bond as cousins, Sarah," Linda continued, her voice dripping with disapproval. "Especially Ethan. It'd do him good to spend time with more active children. He's too quiet for his own good." Sarah felt a flicker of defensiveness flare up inside her. Ethan wasn't like Mia and Noah, who seemed to thrive in the chaos of big groups and loud activities. He preferred his own company, losing himself in imaginary worlds of dinosaurs and superheroes. But to Linda, that was a problem that needed fixing, a reflection of Sarah's lenient parenting. "Ethan has his own pace, Mom," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "He's fine the way he is." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that always made Sarah brace for more criticism. "Well, just don't be late tomorrow," Linda finally said, her tone curt. "We're meeting at the hotel lobby at 8 a.m. sharp." Sarah nodded, even though her mother couldn't see her. "Got it," she muttered before the call ended with a click. She set the phone down and looked over at Ethan, who was pretending not to have heard the conversation. But she could see the slight tension in his small shoulders, the way his fingers hesitated over the puzzle pieces. "Was Grandma worried about me again?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's heart ached at the question. Ethan was only 6, but he was perceptive. Too perceptive for his own good sometimes. "Grandma just makes it her job to worry about everyone," she said with a soft smile, sliding off her chair to sit beside him on the floor. "But don't worry, buddy. Tomorrow's going to be a fun day." She hoped she sounded more convincing than she felt. The truth was, Sarah was dreading the trip as much as she was looking forward to it. Universal Studios had been planned months ago as a birthday celebration for Noah, Jessica's youngest, but the timing couldn't have been worse. A major client had requested an urgent conference call tomorrow afternoon, and there was no way Sarah could push it back. She'd have to find a quiet corner of the park to take the call, laptop balanced on her knees, while Linda and Jessica no doubt judged her for not being present. The thought alone made her stomach churn. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Jessica. "Swinging by at 6. Noah wants to see Ethan before tomorrow. Also, let's go over the schedule." Sarah sighed, typing a quick reply. "Sounds good, but I've got a call at 2 p.m. tomorrow. Might take 30 minutes. Jessica's response came almost instantly. "No prob. Mom and I will watch Ethan. Focus on your work." Sarah felt a flicker of gratitude, but it was quickly overshadowed by unease. Linda and Jessica's idea of watching Ethan usually came with a side of unsolicited advice. "He needs to be more social," or "You're spoiling him too much." Ever since Sarah had become a single mom 3 years ago, their critiques had been relentless. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small flip phone, an emergency device she'd bought for Ethan after a scare at the mall last year. "We'll take this with us tomorrow, okay?" she said, checking the battery. "If anything happens, you call Mom right away." Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "Will I be with Grandma and Aunt Jess for long?" he asked, his voice tinged with worry. Sarah pulled him into a hug, her heart swelling with love. "Just for a little while," she promised. "Mom will be back quick." The doorbell rang and Sarah glanced at the clock. 6:00 p.m. on the dot. Jessica's punctuality was both a blessing and a curse. She opened the door to find her sister standing there, blonde hair pulled into a perfect ponytail, dressed in designer athleisure wear. Behind her, Mia and Noah stood in matching denim jackets, their faces lit up with excitement. "You ready for tomorrow?" Jessica asked brightly, her voice ringing with enthusiasm. Sarah forced a smile, stepping aside to let them in. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said, her mind already racing with the challenges ahead. Tomorrow was supposed to be a magical day for Ethan, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was bound to go wrong. Little did she know, the real magic and the real nightmare was yet to come. The morning sun beat down on Universal Studios Hollywood, casting a golden glow over the bustling entrance as families poured in through the gates. The air buzzed with excitement. Children's laughter mingled with the upbeat music spilling from nearby attractions, while the scent of popcorn and cotton candy wafted through the crowd. Sarah Harris held Ethan's small hand tightly as they navigated the sea of people, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a forced smile plastered on her face. Ethan's eyes were wide with wonder, darting from the towering globe at the entrance to the colorful banners advertising his favorite anime characters. "Look, Mom!" he exclaimed, pointing at a mural of a spiky-haired hero on the wall. "It's just like on TV." Sarah's heart warmed at his enthusiasm. For a moment, the stress of the past few days melted away. "Pretty cool, huh?" she said, squeezing his hand. "We'll see him up close soon." Behind them, Linda Harris unfolded a park map with the precision of a general planning a battle strategy. "Let's hit the big attractions first," she announced, her voice cutting through the noise. "Wait times only get worse later." Jessica Brooks nodded in agreement, her blonde ponytail bouncing as she adjusted the matching backpacks on Mia and Noah's shoulders. "We need a group photo by the Globe first," Jessica added, pulling out her phone. "It'll look amazing on Instagram." Sarah suppressed a sigh. Of course, Jessica's first priority was the perfect photo op. "Everyone line up," Jessica called, waving Mia, Noah, and Ethan into position. Ethan glanced up at Sarah, his expression hesitant. She gave him an encouraging nod and gently nudged him forward. "Go on, buddy. Smile for Aunt Jess." The kids shuffled into place, Ethan looking slightly out of place between Mia and Noah, who were already striking poses like seasoned influencers. Jessica snapped a flurry of photos, her face lighting up as she reviewed them on her screen. "Perfect," she declared, already typing out a caption in her head. Sarah checked her watch. 10:00 a.m. 4 hours until her conference call. She silently prayed she'd find a quiet spot in the park to set up her laptop. Linda clapped her hands, drawing everyone's attention. "All right, let's move. First stop, the Wizarding World." The group set off, weaving through the crowded pathways as the kids chattered excitedly about the rides ahead. The first 2 attractions went smoothly enough, though the wait times were longer than expected. Ethan's eyes sparkled with pure joy as they rode a simulator based on his favorite anime, his small hands gripping the safety bar as he laughed through every twist and turn. Sarah couldn't help but smile, snapping a quick photo of his beaming face to send to her best friend later. For a brief moment, she felt like everything might actually turn out okay. But as they sat down for lunch at a park restaurant, her phone buzzed with an email that shattered her fragile sense of calm. The subject line read, "Urgent, conference call rescheduled to 1 p.m. Sarah's stomach dropped. She glanced at her watch. It was already 12:30. "No way," she muttered under her breath, opening the email to confirm. Sure enough, her client had moved the meeting up an hour, leaving her with barely enough time to prepare. "Everything okay?" Linda asked, her tone more curious than concerned, as she handed out trays of burgers and fries to the kids. Sarah forced a smile, her mind racing. "Yeah, just my call got moved up to 1, she said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Don't worry," Linda waved a hand dismissively. "We'll take care of Ethan. You focus on your work." Jessica nodded in agreement, her attention already split between her phone and Mia's ketchup-stained shirt. "We're heading to Splash Mountain next anyway," Jessica said. "Ethan will have fun with Mia and Noah, right?" She flashed a bright smile at Ethan, who looked less than convinced. Sarah hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay with her son. But she had no choice. The client was too important to risk upsetting. "You okay with that, buddy?" she asked Ethan softly, searching his face for any sign of distress. Ethan nodded slowly, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "Come back quick, okay?" he murmured, his voice barely audible over the chatter of the restaurant. Sarah's heart clenched at the quiet plea. "I'll be back before you know it," she promised, leaning down to kiss his forehead. She slipped the emergency flip phone into his pocket, double-checking it was charged. "You've got this if you need me, okay?" Ethan nodded again, clutching his stuffed dinosaur toy a little tighter. With a deep breath, Sarah grabbed her laptop bag and headed out of the restaurant, scanning the park for a quieter spot. The noise of the crowds faded slightly as she found a shaded bench near a less busy area, setting up her laptop with trembling hands. The meeting started promptly at 1, and for the first half hour it went better than expected. The client was pleased with her designs, asking detailed questions about the next steps. Sarah answered confidently, her focus razor-sharp despite the chaos around her. By 1:45, she was wrapping up, feeling a flicker of relief. "That concludes my presentation," she said politely. "Any questions?" A few minutes of follow-up later, the call ended, and Sarah closed her laptop with a sigh of exhaustion. It was too... She'd kept her promise to Ethan. Now it was time to find him. She checked her phone as she started walking towards Splash Mountain, expecting to see a text from Jessica or Linda confirming where they were. But there were no notifications. A faint unease settled in her chest, but she brushed it off. They were probably still in line or just finishing the ride, as Jessica had suggested. The crowds grew thicker as she approached the attraction, the sound of splashing water and shrieking riders filling the air. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out, expecting a message from her family. Instead, her blood ran cold as she saw the caller ID. Ethan, emergency phone. Ethan? She answered, her voice trembling as she stopped dead in her tracks. Mom? Ethan's small voice came through, shaky and on the verge of tears. I'm alone. The world around Sarah seemed to freeze despite the noise and movement of the park. Her heart pounded in her chest, a deafening thud against her ribcage. Where are you? She gasped, her voice rising with panic. At the entrance, Ethan whimpered, his words barely coherent through his sobs. Grandma left me. I got scared. Alarm screamed in Sarah's head as she clutched the phone tighter. Don't move, baby, she said, her voice cracking with fear. I'm coming right now. She broke into a run, pushing through the crowds with no regard for the annoyed glances or muttered complaints. Her lungs burned as she sprinted toward the park's main entrance, her mind racing with 1,000 terrifying scenarios. How could this have happened? She had trusted Linda and Jessica to watch him for just an hour. How could they have left him alone? Fury and fear battled inside her as she dialed Linda's number, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Mom, where's Ethan? She demanded the moment Linda picked up, her voice a mix of anger and desperation. Oh, Sarah, Linda replied, her tone infuriatingly calm. He's enjoying Splash Mountain with Mia and Noah. Relax. Sarah's grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles turned white. No, he's not, she shouted, drawing stares from passers-by. He just called me. He's alone at the park entrance. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line before Linda spoke again, her voice faltering. That can't be right. I thought he was with Jessica. Sarah's vision blurred with tears of rage. He wasn't with you? She snapped, her voice trembling. He didn't want to go on the ride, so I left him with Jessica, Linda stammered, her confidence crumbling. I thought she was watching him. Sarah didn't wait for more excuses. She hung up and immediately dialed Jessica, her legs still carrying her toward the entrance as fast as they could. Emmy, I'm busy right now, Jessica answered, her voice distracted. Noah needs to go to the bathroom. Where's Ethan? Sarah interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut through steel. Isn't he with Mom? Jessica replied lightly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. No, Jessica, he's alone at the entrance. Sarah's voice broke as the reality of the situation crashed over her. What? Jessica sounded confused for a moment before letting out a dismissive snort. Well, my kids would never get left behind. I always keep an eye on them. Sarah hung up without another word, her anger boiling over as she pushed through the last of the crowd separating her from the entrance gates. Her eyes scanned the area frantically until she spotted him, a small figure sitting on a bench near the globe, hugging his knees to his chest, his face streaked with tears. Ethan! She cried out, her voice raw with emotion as she ran to him. Ethan looked up, his red-rimmed eyes lighting up with relief at the sight of his mother. He jumped off the bench and flung himself into her arms, clinging to her as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. Mom, he sobbed, burying his face in her shoulder. Sarah dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around him so tightly she could feel his heartbeat against her own. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she rocked him gently, whispering over and over, "It's okay, baby, Mom's here now." The noise of the park faded into the background, the laughter and music a cruel contrast to the terror still coursing through her veins. She had promised Ethan a magical day, but instead, he had been abandoned in a sea of strangers. And as she held her trembling son, Sarah knew one thing for certain: this day was far from over. Sarah Harris knelt on the pavement near the Universal Studios entrance, her arms wrapped tightly around Ethan as his small body shook with quiet sobs. The chaos of the park swirled around them, families laughing, music blaring from nearby attractions, the distant roar of roller coasters. But in that moment, it all faded into a muted hum. Her tears mingled with his as she pressed her cheek against his hair, whispering, "It's okay, baby. Mom's here now." Ethan's grip on her shirt was so tight it hurt, but Sarah didn't care. The terror of hearing his trembling voice over the phone still lingered, a sharp ache in her chest that refused to fade. She had left him for just an hour. How had it come to this? A shadow fell over them, and Sarah looked up to see a man in a Universal Studios uniform approaching. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a neatly trimmed beard, his name tag identifying him as Mike Carter, security manager. His expression was calm but concerned, his dark eyes softening as they took in the scene before him. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice steady yet warm, carrying the faint trace of a southern accent. Sarah blinked up at him, her throat tight with emotion as she tried to find the words. I'm his mom," she managed, her voice cracking. "He was alone. I just found him." Ethan peeked out from her embrace, his face streaked with tears, still clutching his stuffed dinosaur toy like a lifeline. Mike crouched down to their level, his movements slow and deliberate as if he were used to handling situations like this. "Hey there, little man," he said gently, offering Ethan a small smile. "You did the right thing staying here by the entrance. That's real smart." Ethan sniffled, his grip on Sarah loosening slightly as he glanced at the man. Mike turned his attention back to Sarah, extending a hand. "I'm Mike Carter, head of security here. One of our staff noticed your son crying and flagged me down. Let's get you both somewhere quieter to calm down." Sarah nodded numbly, shaking his hand with a trembling grip. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She stood, lifting Ethan into her arms despite his growing size. He was 6, but in that moment he felt as small and fragile as a toddler. Mike led them through a side gate marked staff only, away from the bustling crowds and into a quieter area of the park. The noise faded as they entered a small room behind the scenes, a cozy space with soft sofas, a mini fridge stocked with water and juice, and a basket of toys in the corner. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, a stark contrast to the sticky sweet air outside. "Take your time," Mike said, gesturing to the sofa. "I'll grab some water for you both." Sarah sank onto the cushions, Ethan still clinging to her as she rubbed soothing circles on his back. Mike returned with 2 bottles of water and a small pack of animal crackers, setting them on the table before pulling up a chair. "Would you like some water, buddy?" Sarah asked Ethan, her voice soft. He nodded, his red-rimmed eyes darting nervously around the room before he took a small sip. The tears had stopped, but his hands still trembled as he held the bottle. Mike leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his demeanor calm but attentive. "Can you tell me what happened, little guy?" he asked Ethan, his tone gentle but encouraging. Ethan glanced at Sarah, seeking permission. She nodded, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "It's okay," she whispered. Ethan hesitated, then spoke in a small voice. "I was with Grandma, but I didn't want to go on the big water ride. It looked scary. So she told me to wait by the bench with Aunt Jess, but then they all went on the ride and I waited and they didn't come back." His voice grew smaller with each word, his shoulders hunching as he relived the memory. "Lots of people walked by. I got scared, so I walked here 'cause I remembered the big ball thing." Sarah's chest tightened as she listened, her anger at Linda and Jessica bubbling up again. How could they have been so careless? But before she could spiral into rage, Mike nodded understandingly. "That was a really brave choice, Ethan," he said, his voice steady. "When you're lost in a place like this, finding a big landmark or somewhere you've been before is exactly the right thing to do." Ethan managed a tiny smile, his grip on his dinosaur toy loosening slightly. Turning to Sarah, Mike's expression grew more serious. "Can you fill me in on what led to this?" he asked. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands still trembling as she recounted the events of the day. The rushed morning, the conference call, leaving Ethan with her mother and sister, and the horrifying moment she'd received his call. "My mom said it wasn't a big deal," she said bitterly, her voice shaking. "And my sister, she acted like it couldn't possibly be her fault because her kids would never get lost." She shook her head, tears welling up again. "I should have been more careful." Mike's jaw tightened briefly, but his tone remained calm. "Miss Harris, you gave your son an emergency phone. That's what ensured his safety today. You did your part. The problem lies with the family members who neglected to supervise him." His words hit Sarah like a wave of relief, washing away some of the guilt that had been gnawing at her. She hadn't realized how much she'd been blaming herself until that moment. A child being alone in a park this size is a serious situation, Mike continued, his voice firm but not unkind, especially for a kid Ethan's age. We take that seriously here. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Thank you, she said again, her voice steadier this time. Mike stood, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I'd like to make up for this rough experience with something special, he said, his tone brightening. Ethan looked up, curiosity flickering in his eyes. How'd you like to be a VIP today? Mike asked, pulling a shiny badge from his pocket and holding it out to Ethan. We can do a backstage tour, priority boarding on rides, maybe even meet some characters up close. Ethan's eyes widened, a spark of excitement replacing the lingering fear. Really? He asked, his voice small but hopeful. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat, not just from gratitude, but from seeing her son's face light up after such a terrifying ordeal. It's so kind of you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But you don't have to. Mike cut her off with a wave of his hand. We take pride in making our guests' experiences the best they can be, he said warmly, especially for kids who've been through something like this. Within the hour, Sarah and Ethan were walking through the park's backstage areas with Mike as their guide. Ethan wore his VIP badge proudly on his chest, his earlier tears forgotten as he marveled at the behind-the-scenes magic. This is where we keep the character costumes, Mike explained, showing them a room filled with racks of colorful outfits. Ethan's face lit up as he spotted his favorite anime character's costume, and Mike arranged for a quick photo op with the actor who played him. Sarah snapped pictures on her phone, her heart swelling as Ethan's laughter filled the air. They moved on to priority boarding for rides, skipping the long lines that had frustrated them earlier in the day. Ethan's smile grew wider with each attraction, his fear replaced by the pure joy of a 6-year-old experiencing the magic of Universal Studios. Sarah watched him closely, her own anxiety slowly melting away. She hadn't realized how much she needed to see him happy again until now, as they exited a ride based on a superhero movie. Ethan tugged at her hand, pointing excitedly at a control room where staff managed the ride's effects. "Mom, look!" he exclaimed. Mike chuckled, leading them over for a closer look. "Want to see how it all works?" he asked. And Ethan nodded so vigorously, Sarah couldn't help but laugh. For the first time that day, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this disaster could turn into a memory they'd cherish, one where Ethan's bravery and the kindness of a stranger had saved the day. But as they continued their VIP tour, Sarah's phone buzzed with a new message from Jessica. "Saw you running earlier. Don't make a big deal out of this, okay? People are staring." Sarah's grip on her phone tightened, her earlier relief giving way to a fresh wave of anger. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The afternoon sun dipped lower over Universal Studios Hollywood, casting long shadows across the park as Sarah Harris and Ethan continued their VIP experience with Mike Carter as their guide. Ethan's laughter echoed through the backstage areas, his earlier tears a distant memory as he clutched his shiny badge and marveled at every new discovery. Sarah walked beside him, her phone buzzing incessantly in her pocket. She ignored it at first, too caught up in the joy of seeing her son transform back into the carefree 6-year-old she knew. But as they paused near a control room for a superhero ride, she finally pulled out her phone, intending to snap another photo of Ethan's beaming smile. Instead, her eyes caught on the flood of notifications lighting up her screen. Instagram likes, comments, and messages piling up at an alarming rate. Curious, Sarah opened the app, her stomach twisting as she realized what had happened. Earlier, in a moment of raw emotion, she had posted a photo of Ethan with his VIP badge, captioning it, "A tragedy of my son being left alone at Universal Studios turned into a special memory." She'd added a short explanation. "Today, my 6-year-old was abandoned by family during a work call. The fear when he called me crying is indescribable, but thanks to the park's amazing staff, especially security manager Mike Carter, it became a magical experience. Sometimes the worst moments turn into the best memories." She hadn't thought much of it at the time, just a way to process the day and express her gratitude, but now, hours later, the post had exploded. It had been shared hundreds of times, racking up thousands of likes and comments. A local parenting influencer had reposted it, and suddenly, Sarah's story was everywhere. Her inbox was flooded with messages, support from strangers, empathy from other parents who'd had similar scares, even a few local news outlets asking for interviews. But alongside the support came a wave of criticism aimed squarely at Linda and Jessica, though Sarah hadn't named them directly. Comments like, "What kind of family leaves a kid alone in a theme park?" and "Those people should be ashamed," filled the thread. Sarah's heart raced as she scrolled, a mix of vindication and unease settling in her chest. She hadn't meant to start a firestorm. She just wanted to share a moment of relief. But now, the internet had taken her story and run with it. Meanwhile, across the park, Linda Harris sat on a bench near the Minion ride, her trembling fingers clutching her phone as she scrolled through the same comments. Her face was pale, her usual air of confidence replaced by a rare vulnerability. Beside her, Jessica Brooks bit her nails nervously, her own phone screen mirroring Linda's. "Even my PTA group is talking about this," Jessica whispered, her voice tight with panic. "One of the moms just messaged me saying, 'I'm a terrible aunt. I can't show my face at the next meeting.'" Linda looked up, her eyes brimming with tears, a sight Jessica hadn't seen since their father's funeral years ago. "We need to call Sarah again," Linda said, her voice unsteady. "She'll listen this time, won't she?" Jessica shook her head, her expression a mix of frustration and guilt. "I've tried 3 times already. She's not picking up." She'd sent a message earlier. "Saw you running earlier. Don't make a big deal out of this, okay? People are staring." But now, seeing the fallout, she regretted her dismissive tone. The reality of their actions was crashing down around them, and there was no escaping it. "How could she post this online?" Jessica muttered, her voice rising. "She's making us look like monsters." Linda didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on a particularly harsh comment. "Whoever left that poor kid alone doesn't deserve to be called family." She swallowed hard, the weight of her own words from earlier that day. "Don't make a big deal out of it," echoing in her mind like a cruel taunt. For the first time, she couldn't muster a defense. "We need to find her," she said finally, standing up with a newfound resolve. "We'll apologize in person." Jessica nodded, but her anxiety only deepened as they set off through the park, weaving through the crowds in search of Sarah and Ethan. Finding them in the sea of visitors was no easy task, and the wait times at each attraction slowed their progress. As they approached the VIP entrance to the Minion ride, Jessica froze, pointing ahead. There they were, Sarah and Ethan, guided by a park employee, entering a restricted area. Ethan was smiling, his VIP badge glinting in the sunlight, while Sarah laughed at something he said. It was a picture of happiness that stung Jessica more than she expected. "They're not even looking for us," she murmured, her voice small. Before they could approach, the entrance closed behind Sarah and Ethan, leaving Linda and Jessica to join the regular line. The wait time display read 40 minutes, and Jessica's frustration boiled over. "I can't wait this long," she snapped, her voice drawing a few curious glances from nearby families. "And where are Mia and Noah anyway?" Linda turned to her, her expression shifting to alarm. "What do you mean, where are they?" Jessica's face flushed with embarrassment as she stammered, "Well, while we were in line for the speed racer ride earlier, they said they wanted ice cream, so I gave them some money and told them to come right back. The stand was just around the corner." Linda's eyes widened in disbelief. "Jessica, you left them too?" she exclaimed, her voice rising. "They're 8 and 5. They're not old enough to wander off alone." Jessica bristled, her defensiveness kicking in. "I didn't abandon them. I was going to meet them after I got off the ride. It's not the same thing." But as the words left her mouth, a cold realization washed over her. It was the same thing, or close enough. Linda checked her watch, her hands trembling. It's 4:30 now. That was over an hour ago. The two women exchanged a horrified glance, the same terrible thought dawning on them simultaneously. Without another word, they abandoned the line and raced toward the ice cream stand, their hearts pounding in unison. When they arrived, panting and disheveled, there was no sign of Mia or Noah. Jessica's voice trembled as she called out their names, her eyes scanning the crowd frantically. A young clerk at the stand noticed their distress and stepped forward. "Can I help you?" he asked, wiping his hands on his apron. Have you seen my kids? Jessica blurted out, her voice shaking. An 8-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy. They were here for ice cream. The clerk nodded, his expression softening. Yeah, I remember them. They bought cones about an hour ago and waited around for a bit. When no one came, one of our staff took them to the Lost Children's Center in the middle of the park. Jessica's knees nearly buckled with relief, but the guilt that followed was crushing. She had always prided herself on being the perfect mom, the one who never made mistakes. Yet here she was, facing the same nightmare Sarah had endured hours earlier. Linda grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the center of the park. Let's go, she said, her voice tight with urgency. As they hurried through the crowds, Jessica's mind raced. She had judged Sarah so harshly, my kids would never get left behind, but now she saw her own failure in stark clarity. The image of herself as an infallible mother shattered like glass. And for the first time, she felt the weight of her own hypocrisy. At the Lost Children's Center, a kind-faced woman at the counter confirmed that Mia and Noah were safe. They're in the play area with staff, she said, pointing to a door behind her. But the security manager would like a word first. Jessica's stomach churned as Mike Carter appeared, his expression stern but professional. Ms. Brooks, Mrs. Harris, he greeted them, his tone clipped. We've had 2 serious incidents involving your family today. Leaving children unattended in a theme park is dangerous, especially young ones like yours. Jessica opened her mouth to explain, but the words caught in her throat. Linda spoke instead, her voice small. We're truly sorry. It was a mistake. Mike nodded, his gaze unwavering. Your children are safe now, but I hope this serves as a wake-up call. He led them to a monitor showing Sarah and Ethan enjoying their backstage tour, Ethan's face glowing with joy. We're giving them a special experience to make up for what happened, Mike explained. They've earned it. Jessica stared at the screen, a pang of envy mixing with her guilt. For the first time, she saw Sarah not as a struggling single mom, but as a strong one who deserved better than her judgment. As they were led to the play area to reunite with Mia and Noah, Jessica knelt down and pulled her children into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. Mommy was wrong. Linda watched, her own eyes misty, and knew that this day had changed them all, for better or worse. 3 months had passed since that chaotic day at Universal Studios, and Sarah Harris's small Los Angeles apartment had transformed into a haven of warmth and laughter. The late Sunday afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the dining table where the Harris family gathered for their weekly dinner. A new tradition born from the ashes of that fateful trip, the table was crowded with mismatched plates of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and a slightly lopsided chocolate cake Sarah had baked that morning. The air was filled with the sound of chatter and clinking silverware, a stark contrast to the tense silences that had once defined their family gatherings. Sarah sat at the head of the table, watching Ethan as he animatedly recounted a story about a dinosaur exhibit he'd visited with Linda the previous week. Grandma knew all the names, Ethan exclaimed, his brown eyes sparkling with excitement. Even the hard ones like Ankylosaurus. Linda Harris smiled softly from across the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Well, I had to study up, she admitted, her voice gentler than Sarah had ever heard it. Couldn't let my favorite grandson down, could I? Ethan grinned, his cheeks flushed with pride, and Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. This Linda, the one who supported Ethan's quirks instead of criticizing them, was a far cry from the woman who had once dismissed his introversion as a problem to be fixed. Jessica Brooks sat beside her mother, her usual air of perfection noticeably absent. Gone were the designer athleisure wear and the carefully curated Instagram posts. Instead, she wore a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. Mia and Noah played with toy cars at the edge of the table, their laughter mingling with the conversation. Jessica leaned towards Sarah, a sheepish smile on her face. So, you coming to the PTA meeting next week? She asked, her tone tentative. I'm doing a presentation on learning from parenting fails. Figured you might have some Insight, Sarah chuckled, the sound light and genuine. I'd love to, she said, surprised by how much she meant it. The Jessica, who had once bragged about her perfect kids, now seemed more honest, more human. A change Sarah hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. The shift in their family dynamic hadn't happened overnight. After the Universal Studios debacle, Linda and Jessica had shown up at the park exit that evening, their faces etched with guilt as they apologized to Sarah and Ethan in front of the entire family. Linda had admitted to underestimating Sarah's strength as a mother, her voice trembling as she spoke. Jessica, meanwhile, had confessed to her own arrogance, her eyes red from crying after retrieving Mia and Noah from the Lost Children's Center. Those apologies had been the first step, a shaky bridge toward reconciliation. Since then, Linda had started attending counseling sessions to better understand her grandson, while Jessica had shed her facade of perfection, choosing authenticity over appearances. As the meal wound down and the kids migrated to the living room to play a board game, the doorbell rang. Sarah excused herself, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she opened the door. Mike Carter stood on the threshold, a bouquet of daisies in one hand and a sheepish grin on his face. Sorry I'm late, he said, his southern drawl as warm as ever. Work ran long, had to help a kid find his parents near the Jurassic Park ride. Sarah laughed, stepping aside to let him in. Sounds familiar, she teased, accepting the flowers with a grateful smile. Mike! Ethan's voice rang out as he abandoned his game and raced over, launching himself into Mike's arms. Hey, champ! Mike greeted, lifting Ethan effortlessly for a high five. Sarah's heart swelled at the sight. Since that day at Universal Studios, Mike had become a steady presence in their lives. What had started as a thank you coffee after the park incident had blossomed into weekly dinners, movie nights, and quiet conversations that stretched late into the evening. Sarah hadn't expected to find romance in the aftermath of such a disaster, but Mike's kindness and quiet strength had won her over. And Ethan's, too. Dessert time, Sarah announced, setting the chocolate cake in the center of the table as everyone gathered around again. She sliced generous pieces, passing them out with a smile. Let's toast to new beginnings, she said, raising her glass of sparkling cider. The others followed suit, Linda with her coffee, Jessica with a glass of wine, and the kids with their juice boxes. The clink of glasses echoed through the room, a sound that felt like a promise of better days ahead. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah stood by the kitchen counter, watching her family with a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The Universal Studios incident had been a nightmare, but it had also been a turning point. It had forced Linda and Jessica to confront their flaws, brought Mike into her life, and reminded Sarah of her own resilience. Sometimes, she thought, the most unexpected events bring about the most needed changes. Her family had learned that lesson the hard way, and now they were stronger for it.